Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. In this video, I will review a theory of culture in chapter 11 about culture as text, narrative, and hermeneutics. Another important current in structuralism, however, has to do with narrative inquiry and the manner in which it's sustained by the sequential organization of scenes. Roland Barthes describes how one particular story works in the pleasure of the text. In addition, he argues that the storyline is a major source of gratitude for readers, with their anticipation and conclusion. When structuralists take a narrative analysis approach, especially conventional stories and literature, their activity is often referred to as structuralist poetry. The central theme here is often not binary opposition, but plot, characters, and genre. Proponents of the approach see it as a step toward a more scientific approach to literature criticism that goes beyond traditional evaluative criticism and tries to establish value-free benchmarks for classifying and exploring texts. Vladimir Propp can be considered a true pioneer in the structural analysis of culture. Written in the 1920s, his work on the morphology of the folk tale is substantially about myth. Propp's main interest is in the thematic organization of these popular traditional stories. He notes certain similarities in the structure of the hunters of story he studied, even though the character and even work certainly differ from one another. Propp argued that every narrative consists of what he called a function. Propp claims that there are never more than 31 functions in a fairy tale, and more importantly, they always appear in the same order. Basically, stories that look completely different on the surface have the same basic structure. Here are Propp's first 6 functions. 1. A family member leaves the house. 2. Prohibition is aimed at horse. 3. The prohibition is violated. 4. Criminals attempt reconnaissance. 5. Criminals receive information about their victims. 6. Criminals try to trick their victims into taking their property or belongings. Propp also notes that stories tend to have characters who fulfill assigned roles as required by the function system. What we must pay attention to is the organization of stories in terms of depth and fundamental similarities rather than surface variation. Propp has set an example for structuralist poetry by replacing the aesthetics of traditional literary criticism with a more scientific and value-natural way of interpretation. Bakhtin's reputation is centered on two main concepts, namely dialogue and carnival. The dialogical idea touched on the creative and relation aspect of the novel and was used by Bakhtin to criticize the Saussurean approach to symbolism. He dubbed such a perspective abstract objectivism, failing to take into account the ways in which the meaning of a work may change over time or vary according to the particular culture context in which the reader is situated. According to Bakhtin, structuralist understanding can only support a fixed or monological view of meaning that frames the reader as passive. Bakhtin's dialogical model marks a kind of middle ground between the objectivist and subjectivist position. He suggests that individual subjectivity and answerness consists of signs and meaning that come from our broader culture. According to Bakhtin, when we read the text, there is a meeting between objective signs and their meaning with subjective ones and the interior for the individual. There is a boundary zone where two sets of signs mix in some sort of dialogue, with text producing counter statements from the reader in an age of interpretation. Batin also emphasized the role of the social historical concept in shaping society meaning of word and sign. He suggested that these worlds shift over time and between social classes. As a result, word and sign are often ambiguous and characterized by multisentality. He saw this as a good thing. This ensures that the culture is dynamic and has a built-in capacity for flexibility and change. Apart from the empirical reality of multisentality, Bakhtin argues that there are attempts to explore the ideological meaning of words by the dominant group. This will forge a language of unity and interpretation known as monoglossia. The concept of heteroglossia makes use of the notion of a double sign and concept-dependent reading system around a given concept. Speech aids or writing text and expect to find tension between centripetal meanings, which allow mutual understanding, and centrifugal process, which tend to lead to heteroglossia. He writes, every concrete utterance of the speaking subject serves as the point at which both centrifugal as well as centripetal forces are bound to work. Batin also views heteroglossia as a good thing. He thinks it encourages reflexivity about the role of language, helps generate dialogue, and stabilizes hegemonic meaning, which goes hand in hand with monoglossia, resulting in a language that is rich and predictable and dynamic. What is interesting about Bakhtin is being able to theorize for the role of the reader and the local context while still acknowledging uh, the inhibiting power of collective language and symbolism in the interpretive process. The vision of word and sign moving in a complex and active patterns stand in stark contrast to Saussure's rather rigid vision of structuralism in tone and substance. It bears a somewhat closer resemblance to the post-structural theory of the discursive field, which emphasizes complexity, multifocality, power, and ambivalence. It's not surprising, therefore, that Bakhtin was enthusiastically championed in the field of post-structural literary criticism. Hermeneutics as a field deals with issues of common meaning and understanding. Traditionally, it tends to be subjective, humanistic, individualistic, aesthetic, philosophical, and phenomenological in orientation. Recently, hermeneutics has taken lessons from structuralism, post-structuralism, and narrative theory, so that the boundaries between hermeneutics and other forms of culture inquiry have begun to unravel. Delthey argues that interpretation is not just about getting inside a person's head, but can also involve the formation of the intellectual situation and the social environment in which they work. In other words, hermeneutic is compatible with a broader investigation of culture. In his youth, Goethe was a student of Talcott Parsons. As his career progressed, he moved away from personal theory. Most of Parsons' critics argued that he is too cultural and his model of society to emphasize the role of culture. In the interpretation of culture, Goethe takes another route. He claimed there that Parsons was not cultured enough and went on to outline an alternative vision. In his discussion of ideology as a culture system, he suggests that the Parsons model tends to understanding culture as a response to social tension and as a mechanism for dealing with it. For Goethe, this provides us a reader limited understanding of the role and power of culture and has little more than the most basic conception of the symbolic formation process. In contrast, Goethe argues that culture is an active and constitutive dimension of social life rather than just a tedious mechanism for ensuring social integration. He sees it as providing a symbolic template or blueprint through which people can make their world meaningful on both a cognitive and emotional level. Critics begin to move away from the personal vocabulary of norms and values to describe cultural life and instead work on a rich understanding of culture object. And so it was during the 1960s that great understanding culture as a very complex texture of signs, symbols, myths, routines, and habits that required a hermeneutic approach. He wrote, "Man is an animal dependent on an important web which has been spun by himself. I regard cultural as that web, and his analysis is therefore not an experimental science that seeks laws but an interpretive search for meaning." The hermeneutic method tries to draw big conclusions from small but very dense textual facts. In other words, there should be an unified, interpretive, and ethnographic focus on small, real-time events rather than massive effort. Here he asserts that analysis must be based on dirty data of life experience, with a culture theory that makes an attempt to capture and textually reproduce the stand of meaning that informs social action in a particular context. Hermeneutics as an area is concerned with issues of meaning and mutual understanding. Traditionally, it has tended to be subjective, humanistic, individualistic, aesthetic, philosophical, and phenomenological in orientation. In the concept of literary criticism, for example, it has been certainly concerned with the arising whether the reader can recover the meanings and thoughts held the author. Narrative theory, by contrast, has tended to be more objectivist in orientation.